Friends, students and colleagues, good afternoon and good evening, everyone in Europe. I'm Yves Tiberghien, Professor of Political Science and co-director of the Center of Japanese Research at UBC. Welcome to our webinar on Japan's eminently avoidable socio-economic decline, a discussion with Bill Emmott, who is kindly joining us from Dublin, Ireland today. We're truly thrilled and honored to have a dream lineup for the discussion as well. Before going further, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral, traditional, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, as well as the Wassanet people, who have called this area home for many thousands of years and continue to do so today. I would also like to give special thanks to our wonderful CJR research and event assistant, Saya Soma, who led most of the So before I invite our speakers and introduce them, first, the chat function has been disabled. Questions should be asked in the Q&A window. Second, please note that this webinar and following Q&A session will be recorded. We will make it available on the UBC, SPPGA, CJR websites, and we'll share it for a period of time. Third, you're not required to use your camera or microphone to participate in a Q&A session. Written questions can be submitted to everyone via the Q&A function and upvoted by you. I will monitor the Q&A window and pose questions using attendees' first names only, unless you choose, of course, the anonymous option. I would now like to introduce the speakers. Our co-speaker and author of the book that's behind this talk, Bill Emmott. Bill is a writer best known for his time as editor-in-chief of The Economist in 1993-2006. And maybe he can tell us the secret of why The Economist always has the sharpest and wittiest covers of any magazine in the world. He has also written many books on Japan, which began with his best-selling The Sun Also Sets back in 1989. Bill is now the chair of the Japan Society of the UK, the International Institute for Strategic Studies, and of Trinity College Dublin's Long Room Hub for Arts and Humanities. Bill is also co-director of the Global Commission for Post-Pandemic Policy. So hopefully we'll get more insight from Bill on this count as well. In 2017-18, he was a visiting fellow at All Souls College, Oxford, and also an honorary fellow at Magdalen College, Oxford. Bill is a fellow of Tokyo College at the University of Tokyo. Bill was presenter and co-author of a documentary film about Italy called Girlfriend in a Coma in 2013, and executive producer of the Great European Disaster Movie in 2015, both shown on the BBC. In total, Bill has written 14 books on Japan, Asia, the 20th century, and Italy, the latest of which was Japan's Far More Female Future, Increasing Gender Equality and Reducing Workplace Insecurity Will Make Japan Stronger. This was published by Oxford University Press in 2020. And in fact, it will be a reference for this talk. In 2016, Japan awarded Bill the Order of the Rising Sun Gold Rays with neck ribbon for services to UK-Japan relations. I'm also very happy to introduce our discussant, who will be Sun Park. Sun Park is a PhD candidate in political science here at UBC and a Liu Scholar in the School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. Sun is a broad comparativist and global political economist with a keen interest in China, Korea, and Japan. She will offer a comparative perspective in her brief comments. Her research focuses on questions of protectionism, non-tariff measures, and US-China rivalry in global trade governance in a larger context. She analyzes what drives countries to steer away from multilateral trading rules in ways that are both explicit and implicit, while still officially supporting free trade. But first, it's a great honor to introduce Professor Joseph Caron, Ambassador Joseph Caron. He's a distinguished fellow of the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada and an honorary professor and honorary research associate at the Institute of Asian Research at UBC. Joseph is a former Canadian High Commissioner to India and former Canadian ambassador to China and Japan. He is, to my knowledge, the only top Canadian diplomat to have served as ambassador in those three very important countries: India, China, and Japan. He has also previously been responsible for coordinating Canada's activities at major international summits, such as the G8. Joseph serves on the board of directors of Manulife Financial Corporation. He's also a recipient of the Order of the Rising Sun, Gold, and Silver. So I will now turn the microphone to Joseph. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yves. Let me make sure the video, here we are. Well, thank you for those generous remarks about my engagement with Japan and Asia. First of all, I commend Yves and the Institute of Asia Research for initiating this session today and inviting my old friend, Bill Emmott, to provide additional insights from the book that has just been published, that he has just published on the role, place of women, the challenge that women face in Japan. I lived in Japan for a total of 17 years, a few years every decade, starting in the 1970s, and was continuously and amazed and shocked by the overall approach that Japanese society took towards women in professional roles, as well as in their social roles. The dimension that most preoccupied me was the extent to which Japanese men would either not acknowledge the structure of society and how it could be unfair towards women, but felt they had really no role in bringing about any change. And that has evolved. It evolved even at the end, I think, of the Showa era, but primarily Heisei. And now that we have the Reiwa, we have a very, very different dynamic. I congratulate Bill for his book, which I've read, which leaves the voice very much to 2021 Japanese women who provide their perspective not only on the challenges they faced, but also the future directions. And I think that the challenge of women that women face will be addressed increasingly actively, and hopefully also by Japanese men, Japanese institutions, and businesses, so that the women of Japan can play a role equal to their skills and their intelligence. I'm very pleased that you've chosen also Sun Park to be the commentator. I've spent quite a bit of time in Korea, although I've never lived there. And of course, became well aware of the similarity of the challenge that Korean women face as well. So I'm looking forward very much to her comments. And thank you again, Yves, for inviting me to make a few opening remarks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Joseph. And now we're going to turn the floor to Bill for the presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Yves, for your generous introduction and far too kind comments. And thank you very much, Joseph, also for your introduction. And it's been wonderful to see you again after some years. And I'm very grateful to University of British Columbia for inviting me today. And thank you to all of the attendees for being here, and I look forward very much to Sun Park's thoughts and ideas from a very comparative perspective after my presentation. My topic is gender equality, and it is my belief that gender equality matters absolutely for its own sake, for the sake of justice, for the sake of Japan's social health and welfare, for the sake of Japan's creativity and like social and economic sustainability. My thesis in the book is that change is underway. Women's role and status in Japan is rising, but from a very low base, as Joseph said. Often people have asked me, particularly because I'm referring particularly to Japanese newspapers have asked me, because I wrote a book a long time ago, 1989, called The Sun Also Sets. They often tend to pick out as a question in interviews. They say, well, is the sun going to rise again? What will Japan look like in the 2030s and 2040s? And one way I answer that these days is to say to the person who's asking me the question, I say, look, I don't know really how Japan is going to be in the 2030s and 2040s, but if you can tell me what will be the role and status of women in the 2030s and 2040s, then I will have a better way to answer your question, because this is an absolutely central issue for the future prosperity, the future stability, the future social welfare and health of Japan. I say that both because of the importance of the issue in its own case, but also because I see it as part of a broad analytical framework, an analytical issue that surrounds the question of Japan, its past and its future. And I think this framework's important also in thinking about how Japan's evolved from the Showa period through Heisei and now into Reiwa. And that framework really can be summed up by those two slightly desiccated words that economists come up with to describe people and their skills and their initiative and their input, and that is human capital. Human capital is basically, in my view, the fundamental issue about Japan, always is and always has been, a country with no natural resources to speak of, and therefore has always really boomed or not, depending on the human capital that it had available. And in the 1960s, 70s, 1980s, when I first encountered Japan and first went to live in Japan as a journalist working for The Economist, the human capital of Japan looked at a very high quality, essentially because of a high quality of education, very evenly spread across the population, but crucially, for today's purpose, across the male population. Japan in the 1970s and 1980s, in relative terms, compared with European countries or North America, had a very high quality human capital and was very good at deploying it in an economic sense, and was very good at developing the skills of that human capital in employment, particularly because of the long periods of loyalty of a Japanese employee to a single employer. And that meant that the employer invested a lot in developing that employee. But it was only really applicable to men. So we have to think about how things are changing. Since 1990, since the beginning of Heisei, and since the bursting of the bubble economy, of course, in 1990, 1991, I think there have been, as we all know, really three big secular changes in Japan, all of which pertain to human capital. They are demography, the aging of the society, very well known. But secondly, much less well known, which I will talk about a lot, female university education, the entry of girls, of high school girls, into four-year universities for the first time in dramatically increased numbers from the 1990s onwards. That's a positive secular change in human capital. And third, a negative secular change in human capital has been the growth of job insecurity among both men and women, and a decline corresponding to that insecurity in the skill development, the training, the sense of commitment that employees have to a single employer, at least expressed across the whole of society in that period. So compared with the 1980s and 1970s, human capital in Japan has improved greatly in one respect, to do with female university education and female accrual of human capital in that sense, and deteriorated partly because of aging. We can debate what we mean by that, but especially because of job insecurity and decline in skill and training. So I'm going to go through that with a presentation. But first, I just want to explain a bit of where I'm coming from in looking at these sorts of issues. I am not a Japanologist strictly defined. I'm not a Japan scholar, but I'm someone who's been observing Japan pretty closely at times, often from a distance at other times, over 4 decades. And that means I always take a very international comparative perspective. I come at Japan with an economics frame of mind, it's true, but also what I would call political economy, really, as a journalist and a non-mathematical economist. But in thinking about Japan, and this, I want to explain this as I go through my presentation, and I think you need to think about it as I explain my position. I have always grappled, and I think that observers of Japan, at least observers of Japan in the aggregate, always grapple, I think, with 3 basic axes or alternative lens through which to analyze Japan. Lens number 1 is, or axis number 1 is exceptionalism versus convergence, which is also describable as the Galapagos sense of Japan as a separate evolution, society and economy, versus a sense of evolution with globalization and modernization, even if the speed and exact nature is determined locally. Second axis and lens that I think is important is the question of, do you look at Japan as a top-down society, centrally directed, centrally controlled, or do you look at it as essentially a bottom-up society, very much determined by social movements, by market forces, of course, but by decentralized factors in all. And third axis is a question of, do you look at Japan in terms of its rigidity, or do you look at Japan in terms of its evolution? Do you focus, therefore, on blockages to change, on the failure to change in certain respects, or do you focus on drivers to change and the way in which change is actively happening? My attitude and my conclusion really is that I tend to look at Japan in terms of convergence. Even if speed is different, essentially the forces on Japan from within and from without are the same as other societies. So similarities matter to me more than differences. I tend to look at Japan more as a bottom-up society. I never believed in the Japan Inc. centrally directed image of Japan that was common in the 1980s and early 1990s. And thirdly, I tend to look at it, albeit sometimes with frustration, in terms of evolution, in terms of changes that are happening and how blockages slow them down or removal of them speed them up, rather than focusing in on it as a rigid society. In thinking about these things, we need to also think about the dominant narratives that have been there in attitudes and approaches to Japan in the aggregate, as I say, in recent years. One dominant narrative has, of course, been economic stagnation post the bubble. Japan did move in terms of economic growth rates from absolutely the top of the rankings of the G7, of the rich industrialized countries, to near the bottom. The only one lower than Japan in the G7 now is the other country that I tend to spend a lot of time focusing on, which is Italy. Abenomics, the narrative of the last 7-8 years, hasn't changed the trend, despite much argument to the contrary. I would argue that the main factor in some improvement in Japan's economic performance in the last 8 years has been the absence of a shock pre-COVID, either externally like 2008 or internally like the 2011 tsunami and Fukushima disaster. So the Abe period was lucky in a sense, rather than especially beneficial in policy terms. And then, of course, a dominant narrative is demography, the shrinking of the population by 500,000 a year, the fact that well over a quarter of the population are over the age of 65, the fact that there are more than 70,000 centenarians over 100s. So those are the dominant narratives. But I believe that there is also an overlooked narrative, and that is to do with the other secular issues I described about women's role in society, on the one hand, the positive side, and insecurity on the other. And I'm just going to share my screen in order to show a small number of slides, and we'll see whether I do it right. That's it. Now, oh no, I need to do the next thing right. And that is at the wrong end of the slides. So here we are. Okay, now I will whisk through these. That's just my title. Now, I think the overlook narrative is this one of female education. Remember, Japan's bubble burst in 1990. The dominant narrative since then has been that of economic stagnation, of lost decades, and then of either actual or perceived partial rebound. But I think it's fundamental to see that despite that apparent economic slump, despite that decline of economic fortunes, families decided in the 1990s and beyond, for the first time, to send their daughters to full four-year university courses, rather than the 2-year junior colleges that had been dominant until the 1990s. And that as a result, the enormous gap in tertiary education between males and females, between boys and girls, narrowed terrifically. This is, of course, a decision both by the families and by the females themselves. And that, I think, represents an important social change, that there was a desire to have that university education, but also a belief in the benefits of that university education. This has left two important inequalities that I would acknowledge absolutely up front. One is that there is still, as this graph shows, a gap. Unlike in North America or most countries in Western Europe, where now university entrance at undergraduate level is pretty much 50-50, or even sometimes slightly higher female entry than male. In Japan, there is still a 5 percentage point gap. It has narrowed a little since this data in 2017, but it hasn't closed yet. And second big inequality, which we may discuss later, is that female access to four-year university education has been much easier in the vast bulk of universities than it has been in the top national universities. So in the top national universities, Tokyo University, Kyoto University, Doshisha, and so on, only between 20 and 28% of undergraduates are female, whereas the national average is 50%. In the top private universities, Keio, Waseda, and others, the female ratio is around 45% to 55%, so much higher. So in the top national universities, which are also the best routes to leadership positions, particularly in the big corporations and in politics and in government, there is still an enormous gender gap. but the broad social change is still there and has led to a much larger set of cohorts in later generations of women coming through the career path. We still see that Japan is at a low base in terms of leadership positions. And this data is from the OECD, from its annual survey of Japan. Japan's share of managerial employment taken by women is the second lowest in the OECD, the lowest being South Korea, and way lower than the 35% in Canada, and basically 30 to 40% across most of the OECD. One reason for this will be that gap in national universities. But another reason is that leadership positions are in Japanese organizations, as I'm sure you all know, are highly correlated to age. These are age-based hierarchies, not in every case, but overall. And that means that the gap that I showed from the 1980s still dominates, because that is the generation now in leadership positions. But as the pipeline of female professionals, university-educated women grows older and enters into the leadership age groups, this number will almost certainly increase. The doyen of gender equality studies and gender equality advocacy in Japan, Mariko Bando, now president of Showa Women's University, but previously in senior ministerial positions of various kinds, including a gender equality office in the cabinet. Her view is that this level, which is currently around 12 to 13%, will double during the next decade, that Japan will move up to still a low position in OECD rankings, but around 25%. So movement is there, it's behind, but it's going to happen quite substantially. This has happened at the same time as a big rise in women's place in the workforce. Ever since 2000, but especially since the mid-2000s, the share of 15 to 64-year-olds in Japan going out to work, finding places in work, has increased really quite rapidly, overtaking the United States in 2015 and coming level with the Euro area, and therefore quite a lot of European countries, still behind Britain and Germany and Scandinavian countries, but much more comparable by global standards. In fact, this has been part of Japan's successful effort to shrug off its shrinking population, the declining demography. Since 2010, the employed population in Japan has risen by 4 million people, even though the total population of Japan has shrunk during that time. How? Well, it's essentially women and retirees. Women have entered the workforce in those growing numbers, and elderly people, well, I say elderly people, people my age who have passed retirement age, then re-enter the workforce, and a greater proportion of over 65s are employed in Japan than in almost any other OECD country, except, in fact, South Korea. Nearly 30%, 28%, I think, the latest number I've seen of over 65s in Japan are in employment, and that compares with 4 or 5% in Italy, the other country I study a lot. So those are big secular changes. But the other secular change is the one I mentioned at the start, which is the rise of insecurity. Japanese employment has moved from an employment status that was dominated by full-time, permanent contract employment, more than 80% in the 1980s, when I was first living in Japan, down to only just over 60%, and with now 40%, nearly 40% of the workforce in non-regular, which means short-term contract and part-time employment. That has decreased the security felt for both men and women. In the 1990s to basically from 1995 to 2005, more men than women were taking up those growing non-regular short-term contract jobs. But since from 2005 on, more women than men have been taking up those non-regular jobs, so that now more than half of non-regular employment is occupied by women. But the point is that the insecurity is common to both men and women. This has led to an increase in relative poverty in Japan, from being a relatively egalitarian society with low levels of poverty to now actually had one of the biggest increases in relative poverty in the OECD over the last 20 years, and increased insecurity, and to really a secular problem of weak household consumption, because household incomes have been depressed by what I think is fair to describe as Japan's cheap labor strategy. Cheap labor strategy to provide a pool of workers for corporations, big and small and medium-sized, who are much cheaper because they don't spend as much money on training and skills, and because they can be turned over quite quickly and kept at pretty low wages. So that financial change has been absolutely fundamental to Japan's social and economic development over these decades. It has had an important social effect, and that is on marriage. The rate of marriage has declined really rather shockingly in a society which is highly oriented towards marriage and highly oriented towards family. Misogynists, I would say, tend to blame this rise, this decline in marriage and the rise in the proportion of the population who are not married on more women going out to work. But this simply is not true, as is partly shown by the fact that it's a far higher proportion of men have reached the age of 50 without ever being married than is true of women. What the literature absolutely shows is that a fundamental driver of this is financial insecurity. Financial insecurity, while in a society where men have continued to be expected to be the essential breadwinners in a family, have continued to be believed to be and expected to be and expect themselves to be breadwinners, financial insecurity has eroded that possibility and led to a large proportion of men never choosing or succeeding in getting married. This is correlated with the rise of the phenomenon of the geek, the otaku, and all of the pop cultural issues that go with that, and the following of pop idols and so forth. It's also correlated, in my belief, with the part of the decline in the fertility rate and the birth rate, because of a decline in family formation, whose root is, in my view, that growth in financial insecurity. So what we are seeing and what I'm describing, what is really the background to this book, is these competing phenomena, a rising quality and extent of female human capital, a much larger pipeline of professionally educated and trained women, greater participation of women in the workforce, in very often part-time and non-regular work, but also in professional work, competing with the declining demography and especially the rising or risen financial insecurity. So our question has to be, which of these will dominate in the future, which will be allowed to dominate? What can policy, public policy and corporate policy do to encourage the benign to dominate over the malign? And I think clearly I think that Japan is going to have a more female future, basically in an organic way, because of this rise in female university education and the arrival of so many women with those skills and with those expectations in employment of all kinds. But the question really is how much more female? How fast will this take place? Will systemic prejudices stand in the way? Will work culture and corporate expectations permit this? Will a critical mass be reached of women in senior positions? And are there enough role models to encourage this process in society? And that can be framed by a general question, which is, will or can public and corporate policy become really focused on human capital, on really enabling and developing the population of Japan, male and female, to be able to fulfill their ambitions and their potentials to the maximum possible, or will it stick with the current essentially cheap labor strategy that has been there since the bursting of the bubble in the early 1990s? We can see the systemic prejudice that stands in the way in this final chart, which is to show again the low base, the share of doctors who are women in Japan. Amazingly low, lower even than South Korea in this case, and a profession that in many countries in the OECD is highly equal between men and women, is highly unequal in Japan. And I mention this both because it's an example of what a low base Japan is at, but secondly because we saw in a scandal a couple of years ago how systemic prejudice works to block the progress of women. When Tokyo Medical University, big, quite prestigious private university, was shown to have fiddled the results of its entrance exams systematically in order to reduce the number of female students who were admitted to train as doctors, and in order to maintain a dominance of men. Women were applying, they were motivated enough to apply, and yet they were being systematically discriminated against. That reflects, I would suggest, a systemic problem inside the Japanese health system, inside the way in which the health system, private hospitals, public hospitals, general practitioners, the way in which they manage their doctors and their staff, and the way in which they think about female and male doctors. So while exposing the scandal at the university is the beginning of reform, actually the fundamental reform has to be in the health system itself, which of course then has provided the incentives to the medical university to behave in the terrible way that it did. What's positive about this scandal is that there was dramatic pushback. The fact that the scandal was revealed at all, even though it had presumably been going on for quite a number of years, and that quite a number of female applicants brought out lawsuits against the university for the damage that they had received. So a real pushback, and now Tokyo Medical University has its first female president. So we can see slow change can happen. But there are other things that clearly need to change, particularly in work culture, work-life balance, childcare facilities, which have been improved enormously in Japan in the last 10 years, but are still inadequate, and very much in social structures and the balance of roles in the family. Now, as I said, critical mass is important. Critical mass of females in decision-making positions in organizations, be they public or private sector, be they universities or non-profits. And that critical mass is, I think, coming on Mariko Bando's prediction of a doubling of the share of women in leadership positions. And once you get, experience in other countries shows that once you get a critical mass of women in those decision-making positions, that does accelerate change. The next question has been about role models. And in the past, it often was said that there was a lack of female role models to encourage change to happen, to encourage women in their ambitions, but also to encourage men to take women appropriately seriously and to admit women. And part of the focus of my book has been to talk to and learn from many of the existing role models, and this is just a sample of them Hiroi Higuchi, a chef, Machiko Ogawa from Panasonic, the board director, head of the Technics brand at Panasonic, and also a jazz concert pianist in her spare time. You all know of Yuriko Koike, Noriko Ishikawa, who's running a waste recycling business she took over from her father. Tamako Mitarai, CEO of Kesenuma Knitting, a very entrepreneurial business up in the tsunami-damaged village. Kanako Baba, running a school uniform recycling business and now advising these organizations how to work all over Japan. Tomomi Nishimoto, orchestral conductor. Chiaki Hayashi, who's an entrepreneur in the tech sector. And my friend Mari Miyoshi, who was a Japanese ambassador to Dublin and is one of the 2 most senior female members of staff in the Gaimosho in the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And finally, probably the best single example of change is Naho Kono, president of Rakuten Ichiba, Japan's biggest e-commerce business, chief marketing officer for the whole of Rakuten business, a recent mother, absolutely working with a fantastic career also ahead of her, and doing something that could never have happened in the 1970s or 1980s. So I think a single person example of change and how change can be driven, and a great role model. So we do, just to finish and to, I must try to work out how to stop this share. Yeah. All right. Yes. So how will this develop into the future? Where will it lead? I think if I was writing like a manifesto, a Japanifesto, I would say that Japan needs to focus on its human capital, both men and women, on reducing insecurity in the labor market, and boosting things like the minimum wage to try to improve the distribution of income and reduce poverty, but very much to remove the blockages of women, both in social life and in employment, which particularly have to do with the tax system, but also to do with childcare and obviously parental leave. But most of all, it's an attitude change that needs to take place in Japanese corporations, but not just corporations, in Japanese organizations of all kinds. I think it's underway, but the speed with which it happens is what's going to most determine the future of Japan in the 2020s and 2030s. And that obviously remains to be determined. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you for listening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, Bill, for a wonderful talk and pretty cool and amazing crisp graphs that really get to the essence of things. You have put your finger on very important trends. And I'm going to now cede the floor to our discussant, Sun Park. The floor is yours, Sun.
Okay, thank you, Yves, and thank you so much for your great talk, Bill. And just let me emphasize that it's my great pleasure and honor to be part of this wonderful book talk as a graduate discussant. Although I'm not a professionally trained Japanologist, the book was very much enjoyable, readable, and the book provided me with historical and analytical framework to get to know the evolving nature of Japanese society. So I believe both this book and this event is pretty timely, given that gender inequality is one of the most widely debated topics, not only in Japan, but also in the world. And in addition to that, we need to take widening gender disparity amid the COVID-19 pandemic seriously. So if I may give you some data, according to the World Economic Forum's 2021 Global Gender Gap Report, the pandemic is widening gender inequality across Asia. The report estimates it'll now take 135 years for the world to achieve gender parity, while it would take 99 years before the pandemic. Obviously, the pandemic is likely to have a scarring effect on future economic opportunities for women who already experience both higher unemployment rates and slower re-entry into employment. Well, I have to say it's pretty sad to see all those negative estimates. However, considering all, it wouldn't be too much a stretch to say that this book is just perfectly timely. And throughout the book, what most impressed me was its overarching argument that links to the issue of gender inequality or challenges Japanese women are facing to Japanese socioeconomic structural problems, most of which may have been the legacies of the previous 3 decades called Heisei era. And as Bill, the author, said in the book, all of those interwoven issues such as job insecurity, underused human capital despite well-educated population, low wages and low productivity, depressed household income, declining marriage rates, and consequently low fertility, all can be seen as Japan's vulnerability and the society's vicious circle. I guess maybe this is not only confined to Japan. As a member of the young generation who faces the age-old issues of gender discrimination and therefore desperately tries to transform the structure that may have only worsened the gender inequality, this book was just so fabulous to the point where I had to keep nodding while turning over the pages. One of the primary reasons why the author's narrative caught my eyes was that what Japan has been going through was so similar to what Korea is going through now and probably will be going through. Well, as many of you may have heard, Korea is set to follow the exact example of Japan in terms of its economic growth model and patriarchal and hierarchical society. When it comes to women's status, Korea ranked on 102nd, while Japan ranked on 120th, according to Global Gap report, the same report that I mentioned before. So, basically, they are not very much different. And by the way, I'm Korean, and as a Korean who was born and raised in Korea before coming to Canada, I was not able to resist the temptation to compare Japan with Korea, especially when Korea is literally following in the steps of Japan. So this is more like a small heads up. Most of my reflections or questions later on will come out of Korean context. And I have to say, as a political scientist majoring in comparative politics, comparison is just in my DNA. So please bear with me with that regard. Okay, back to the point. Given the glaring gap between women's de jure rights and de facto rights is consisting of the vicious circle in Japan and in Korea as well, I guess my biggest takeaway from this overarching diagnosis is that without a significant and overhauling transformation, not only public policy, but also in what we vaguely call culture, the future will not be very much promising. And this is more like my personal experience. And another point that amused me very much was the author's extensive interviews with 21 women who can be considered success stories in their professional fields. Specifically, as featured in Chapter 6, interviews with Koike Yuriko, the governor of Tokyo, and Hayashi Umiko, the mayor of Yokohama, stood out to me. I think it's more like coincidence, but I was in Yokohama when the Rugby World Cup was held. And it was not that I was there for the sports game, but I was just, passing by the stadiums. And while I was staying in both cities, Tokyo and Yokohama, it was so obvious to see Japanese people's optimism and expectations that the Rugby World Cup and the 2020 Tokyo Olympic, which had to be postponed, would be a catalyst for a change in culture, society, and values, as Bill said in the preface. However, at the time, I didn't come to know that those two women, Koike-san and Hayashi-san, were playing the key leadership role in both cities. And it's so meaningful to see them as pioneering model for future female politicians, especially when Japan ranks the lowest score in terms of female participation in public sector. Okay, let me get straight to my two small questions. And the first one is about a housing issue as one of the underlying challenges to gender inequality. In addition to underused and depleted human capital, depressed household incomes, low wage, and declining productivity growth, I was wondering whether or not the majority of Japanese people are struggling with housing, and if so, Would deadly housing prices be one of the structural factors which could be worsening the already low marriage and birth rate? So, well, to give you some examples from Korea, for most of the young generation in Korea, especially an ordinary salaryman, dreaming about having one's own house, especially in Seoul, the big city, is unthinkable. And it's one of the primary reasons for women to give up a marriage or child rearing, or to push young child rearing mothers to go out and get an insecure job as a non-regular worker. So I was wondering if housing issue is also the same case for Japan, given that, to my best knowledge, Japan, specifically Tokyo, is one of the most expensive cities in the world. And my second question is on any social movement in Japan with the angle of gender inequality. I know that in general, Japanese people don't get into arguments, particularly with their elders at home and at work. Also, I'm very well aware that even if you find someone's remarks or behavior sexist, many would choose not to confront the issue as a part of their efforts to kind of read the air so that the situation doesn't get awkward. I know that it's a really time-honored culture underlying Japanese society, as in Korea. However, I was also wondering if there's any room for the extensively growing social media, like, SNS, Facebook, Twitter, all kinds of things, to offer a platform for the young generation who wants to make a significant change in the deep-rooted gender discrimination. Well, I'd say in Korea, we have seen tons of cases like this. Like, everybody just posted SNS about like how they were treated unequally, something like that, and it'll become a social issue. And sometimes it can be translated into policy outcome too. So relatedly, one may question if there are any substantial and systematic efforts from female policymakers trying to translate these bottom-up pressures toward a better gender parity into a certain policy outcomes. And well, I have to say I actually have a bunch of more questions, so it was really painful to pick just two of them, but let me stop here for more discussions with the floor. And once again, thank you for this wonderful book and great talk, Bill. And thank you so much for inviting me and letting me indulge. I'll stop here. Thank you.
San, thank you for those terrific comments. You did manage to squeeze in 3 questions, which was brilliant. With the second one having another one. Maybe we'll turn to Bill for some response, and then we'll open up to questions. So for the audience, please feel free to start putting all kind of comments and questions in the Q&A box, and then we'll get to them in a minute. So Bill first.
Well, thank you, and thank you very much, Sun, for first of all, your very, very positive comments about the book, but also for your very insightful questions and observations, which I think are particularly interesting, coming from someone with a comparative perspective who knows the South Korean situation, obviously from your upbringing, knowledge, but also knows other Northeast Asian countries. And I would comment that absolutely, I can see that the South Korean position situation is very equivalent, as we could see on a couple of those graphs that I put up. South Korea and Japan are vying for bottom place in the data in various ways. Now, on the questions that you raise, I mean, I'll start with the second one first, which is, are there social movements with an issue of focusing on gender equality? And I'll start with that because I think it is one of the most positive aspects in my perception, which is that I think that from having been quite a silent, often taboo subject in the past, it has become a much more openly discussed issue. And therefore consciousness of it among both men and women has increased as a result. It still takes bravery to speak out. Absolutely, one has to recognize that, particularly as a man, one has to recognize that. But more and more brave women are being brave enough to speak out, and are being supported by other women and forming movements. I mean, I think the most sort of celebrated, or the most extreme case is Shiori Ito, the journalist who was raped by another journalist, and who was quite probably given protection from prosecution because of his connections to leading LDP politicians, including Prime Minister Abe. And Shiori Ito got an enormous amount of hostility and misogynistic and really disgusting response from many people, but also got an enormous amount of support and has been able to continue the fight. Now, she's an outlier, an extreme case, but I think below her kind of extreme experience, there are a large number of other women who have succeeded in generating campaigns about different aspects of the obstacles and challenges that women face, and I think that's a really encouraging part of what's evolving in Japan. Not easy, not the dominant narrative still. Men absolutely only pay lip service to the issue still, rather than really fully embracing it on a wide enough basis. But nevertheless, this is having an impact. More brief, and is seized upon by policymakers and politicians as well. Maybe the best quick example I should give is when the head of the Olympic Committee, former Prime Minister Mori, had to resign earlier this year after making his misogynistic comments about women talking too much in meetings. It was female lawmakers who came out and led some of a lot of the protest against him, and I would say were probably quite influential in forcing him eventually to resign and push him down. Now, he is still a very influential figure in the LDP. He's not really had the ultimate punishment of what he did, but nevertheless, I think we saw that policymakers, female politicians in particular, were very willing to embrace this. Finally, and more briefly on the housing issue, it's not an issue I'm very current on, and therefore I hesitate to say too much about it, but and clearly things have got easier in many ways because of the collapse in the property market and the declining demography population, which has led to a large number of empty properties in Japan, and therefore reduced housing costs in many ways, but not in the big urban areas. And in the big urban areas, which of course is where often the professional competition is at its most intense, housing is a factor. But I would say it's a structural factor for both men and women, making financial insecurity more important, because if you're financially insecure, you can't basically get a long-term mortgage loan to buy a house or an apartment. And that then is part of the disincentive for marriage. I'll stop there.
Great. Bill, I'm going to put a question to you on the more political side, since you have been observing Japan over decades. The politics of gender-friendly policy, right? There have been, I mean, from my observation, there has been ups and downs. Some of it was top-down driven, and actually by men, and obviously we have the Abe case. And some of it was more bottom-up, driven by female leaders and politicians. And I wonder about the difference, right? How you see the difference. So first we have Kaifu, Prime Minister, Kaifu, who is the first to talk about gender and to bring quite a few women into the cabinet and break of a trend here. Hosokawa did continue to some extent, and then there was a bit of a dip until later Koizumi kind of repeated what Kaifu had done. But in the mid-90s, with the coalition, with the very fluid politics, female politicians from Sakigakeo, from the Socialist Party, and even Shinshinto to some extent, and later Minshuto, had influence in coalition, because the LDP was pushed into coalition. And we see an explosion of bills like gender non-discrimination, punishment of sexual harassment, punishment of all kinds. So there's a series of gender-related bills that are really pushed by female politicians that have a big say in the coalition times, right, of the very fluid 1990s. And they use the UN treaties and gender-related UN conferences. Women rights become human rights, and it kind of naming and shaming Japan even at those global conferences. So we see all this, and then there's Koizumi, who kind of takes it, but he turns it into a game. And the way he launched in his postal election in 2005, all those assassins, instrumentalized in a way by himself, but under condition of there's no more coalition. Well, there is with Komeito, but there's less opening. There's less fragility of the LDP, which is more the conservative bastion. Then we see kind of a lull in at least there is no more opening in the declining three prime minister of the LDP. And then, there's then a Minshuto 3 years, and then we get Abe and Womenomics under Abe. But ironically, it's happening at the time where there's much less space for female politicians, and it's a tightly controlled LDP ship, which is really dominated by men. And so I wonder how you review this, and at which moment we saw most increase maybe in women's rights and gender-friendly policy. This paradox of Abe, known to be a more politician, leading womenomics, and it's kind of the pro-gender policy, but how genuine, how far, etc.
Well, that's a very interesting analysis and quite challenging. I think I would say that the single biggest area that's really helped women in terms of policy has been the expansion of childcare facilities and public investment in childcare, and that is under Abe. Under Abe and local governments like Tokyo and Yokohama, but very much led by Abe and under the Womenomics banner. So I think that is, as it were, increased women's opportunities and helped the work-life balance issue. But women's rights, legal rights, moved at in a different pace, and I don't know really what the correct correlation is. I would suspect that at times during those volatile 1990s, female votes looked themselves more important, briefly, at a moment of political volatility and with coalition politics. So a less influence coming from individual politicians, but more from a perceived need and desirability to appeal to female voters. And that may well explain why some of those landmark pieces of legislation happened in those days, when on other respects, female advancement wasn't happening very rapidly. I mean, one can go back to the Equal Opportunity Law, which was 1985, 1986 under Nakasone, as well, by the way, of course. So coming up to date, the central tension is in a way between like a more economic-minded view, which has to say that we need more women in the workforce under Abe, and what can we do to facilitate it, and the conservatism of like the Nippon Kaigi group within the LDP, dominant group, but the conservative group, who essentially stand for traditional family values and traditional social roles, and are the kind of LDP politicians who will either try to block those things or speak out against changes that benefit women, often using the misogynistic language and accusations. And I think in Abe himself, there's probably a tension about this. How can you be a radical conservative is perhaps the fundamental question in a lot of politics in any case. And I think that's one reason why Abe achieved quite a lot in making life easier for women in the workforce, but actually didn't really achieve fundamental change because he was pulled by conservatism. He was also pulled by big business lobbies, which said, keep our labor cheap. We want women, but we want them cheap. And I think that held back really fundamental reforms.
Great. So I'm going to now to call the first question to Saya Soma, who is going to bring it in person. So Saya, apart from being a CJR lead and student assistant, is actually also a brilliant representative of this rising young generation, female generation, always very, very sharp all the time. So Saya, feel free to jump in with comments and then your question.
Thank you. Sorry, I just asked the question as a Q&A, but I'm here, so I'll ask in person as well. Yeah, so I am from Japan, and I really love that you highlighted a lot of role models, female role models, and I am happy that there are more of them now. But I feel like in terms of representation, it is great that role models, like in your example, there are quite a lot of business leaders, some governors, but I feel like there are quite still a strong gender norms in terms of where women would be sort of appropriate to advance. For example, you mentioned that there are not many female doctors. So I feel like, for example, in the businesses you highlighted, there are some fashion business, something like online shopping, things like that. I feel like now it's more open to female leaders, whereas there are certain areas that doesn't really have female leaders. And in relation to that, I feel that in terms of that sort of representation, I was wondering if you could touch on a little bit more about popular culture, because I feel like that's somewhere in terms of Japanese society, I feel is quite influential. And whenever I go back to Japan and watch TV or something like that, I do feel sometimes I do see something problematic in terms of how female comedians or female actresses are sexualized or portrayed in a certain way, like women are appropriate to do this and that. So if you could touch a little bit on more, perhaps not leadership position, but in general, how women are portrayed in popular culture, or something that is more something to do with representation in general.
Very good. No, I think it's a very important issue. I think, I'll say first of all that I'm not, as a non-Japanese and non-female, of course, but also as not living full-time in Japan, I don't think I'm the right person to judge popular culture very, very accurately. But I'll say a couple of things. One is that I think that a big factor in holding up the process, in making it slower, is the media. I think, first of all, it's striking for a European to see that actually the media businesses, journalism and commercial sides, are among the least advanced in Japan in terms of female presence and female leadership. That is slowly changing, but there is not a single mainstream Japanese publication that has a female editor, for example. Not one. And I think that the sort of highly bureaucratic and rather sort of old, in a way, conservative corporate culture of the Japanese media then is reflected in, I think, the portrayals and the narratives that are there, particularly in newspapers, but certainly also on television. And I do think that televisual use of women as in news bulletins, in programs of all kinds, acts as a like a social retardant, typically, rather than an accelerator of change. So there are exceptions, like Hiroko Kuniya, who I mentioned, in the presenter of Close Up Gendai, who was in a very, very important position in a political show for years in Japan. But largely, it would be fair to say that women are female presenters are treated as decorative objects in Japanese television rather than as equals. And that is definitely a social retardant. So I'm less qualified to talk about popular culture, about what's really happening for young people. And I would love to hear from somebody who is well qualified on that. But I definitely agree that television, especially, is a retardant to this process rather than a facilitator.
Great. Syed, do you have any response to that or any?
No, thank you. That's, yeah, I think I agree. And I think in terms of media as well, for example, in watching or reading news, there's not many female presenters, female, what do you call, reporters. So yeah, I agree. Thank you.
Great. So now we have good questions piling up. So we'll take them in turn. So first from an anonymous attendee, an issue with worrying about the growth of women entering higher education is that it doesn't focus enough on maintaining women in the workforce, especially after childbirth. Seems to be a greatly overlooked issue. What steps could possibly be taken to alleviate these pressures from women who are mothers or considering starting a family to re-enter the workforce or maintain their positions in the workforce without negative repercussions from employers, with the overall general lack of support from the workplace, society, and childcare?
Well, that's a great question. My first response is that I didn't want to blizzard you with too many charts. But had I decided to increase some more charts, I would have included some charts on female participation at different ages in Japan. It was one thing that has changed is that while in the 1980s, there was definitely a very marked M shape to the famous M shape to the graph. In other words, female participation in the age of 20s was high, and then at marriage it declined very sharply, and then women re-entered the workforce, but always in less professional or more part-time positions later. That has flattened. Essentially, the Japanese profile of women is now not markedly different from European countries or North America. But, so therefore, that on the face of it, that might say against your position that actually this isn't a problem. But you are right, it is a problem. And that is because it's clearly true that in employment, in corporate culture, taking time off to have a baby is a big disadvantage, an even bigger disadvantage, I should say, in a Japanese company than it is in a Canadian, American, or British company. It's a disadvantage in any company to some extent, but in a Japanese company, it's even bigger. And so that I think that so far human resources thinking in Japanese corporations has not embraced the idea of taking a positive view of maternity and of career breaks that are represented by childbirth in order to keep a very high proportion of the talented women who are there, and therefore you do get an even more marked depression of, if you like, career trajectories. So what can be done is principally at the company level. Maternal and paternal leave in Japan are theoretically among the most generous in the world, but the take-up of paternity leave is very, very low, and that's because of peer pressure in companies. Almost the only thing that I would suggest that you might do at a public policy level is make paternity leave compulsory. I don't know if that really can be done by law, but if it could, it might actually be quite helpful. But certainly, if I was a CEO in a Japanese company, I would actually make paternity leave compulsory by my male employees, which would then produce a more embracing, if you like, corporate culture for family formation. But that is yet to come.
Excellent. So I think Ambassador Caron would like to with some actions. So I'll turn to you, Joseph. Mm-hmm.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Bill, for an excellent presentation. Your comment about the media, particularly the journalists, particularly the written media, being laggard in terms of gender equity, reminded me of an occasion when I was head of mission in Tokyo. I was invited by the Osaka Press Club to make a speech on Canada and Canada-Japan. And I said I would be happy to do that on condition that they took me to an izakaya after my presentation and we could spend a pleasant, if not to say boozy evening. And one of the issues that I raised when at the dinner was, in fact, the issue of the role of women in journalism. And this was the Asahi, this was the Yomiuri, the Nikkei, they were all there. Each one, or just about each paper's representative, explained how they kept female candidates away from the selection process. And some of them were sheepish about it. Others were actually proud of this practice. And so I guess in addition to my comment, my question is, the female, how shall I say, the women models and intellectual leaders, such as you have in the book, are extremely important. But it also requires male spokesmen beyond the politicians who take political positions. So I'd like your thoughts on that. The second is, in the corporate world in Europe and North America, ESG, environment, social and governance issues are increasingly at the top of mind of investors. And my question really is the ESG thrust having some initial impact in Japan in the corporate world? Thank you.
Thank you, Joseph. Great questions, and I'd have enjoyed being at that izakaya with you with those journalists and pressing them about these issues. On the male spokesperson's question, a primary motive for this book was to try to influence men. I hope that I've got female readers as well, and that in the Japanese edition that Nikkei published, and I hope that it's encouraged my female readers. But I was conscious that I have a readership in Japan based on previous books that is primarily male and is primarily in the older age groups in corporate life, in the private sector particularly, but also in the public sector. And that perhaps by writing this book, some of those men might be convinced to think a bit differently, because I think there's an absolute shortage. There is a great shortage still of male spokespeople for this position. They exist, of course. I particularly cited the chief executive of Sompo Insurance, who's taken a very prominent position. There is the 30% chapter in Japan, encouraging, trying to get to 30% of board seats to be held by women, and that is chaired by the chairman of Shiseido, Uotani-san, who's acting as a male spokesperson for female advancement. And there are others, but there absolutely need to be more. And it would be a very good idea if more of them were in the media as well. Just as a side anecdote, I would say that one journalist from a prominent Japanese newspaper, a female journalist, told me that she had been held up in her process by actually the owner of the publication, who had a view insisted on until very recently that women were not suitable to write editorials. And that this was only a male habit. Now, I think all of us in the West should recognize that these sorts of ridiculous ideas were common in the 1950s and 1960s, and probably way beyond in our countries too. So I think it's a process that needs to be pushed and go on the way. On ESG, it's very big now in Japan, actually, and it is beginning to have an impact. One proponent of Womenomics, Kathy Matsui, former vice chairman of Goldman Sachs, has been very good at promoting ESG as well, and in particular, promoting the measurement and transparency about the role of women in a company, all sorts of governance issues. And I think that they have actually made some significant progress in introducing those measures. And this was strongly promoted when the Chief Investment Officer of the Government Pension Investment Fund, GPIF, the world's biggest single investment fund, came out strongly in favor of ESG investing and strongly in favor also of basing gender equality. Now, I would add to that point that I then spoke to a communications person from the GPIF who happened to be a female former employee of the Nikkei, who left working as a journalist at the Nikkei because of difficulties in working as in like advancing her career as a journalist in a male journalistic environment. When I asked her, how is the gender equality balance in the GPIF senior management itself, she laughed and said, it's rather embarrassing. I don't think we should talk about that. So I think everything is a work in progress, shall we say, from this point of view.
Great. So mindful that we have only 8 to 10 minutes and 3 good questions lined up, I'm going to bundle 3. So if you're able to catch some key elements from each of them is excellent. So first of all, from Kyle, following on the question of housing, has your analysis identified any significant trends in gender and economic inequality in terms of regional variances? For example, Tokyo versus Kansai, other cities and rural areas. So that's the first question on regional differences. The second from Ying Cho, who is also a PhD candidate here. I would like to add a follow-up question on Abenomics, in which Abe discussed about the plan to increase women employment in Japanese economy. In your opinion, how is the plan going right now? And how has such creation of jobs for women helped to expand or curb women's roles in politics and society? So that was the second question on assessing Abenomics. And then finally from Dina, joining from Toronto, when I learned Japanese, I was always struck by the levels of humility which women were expected to adopt. Do you believe that language will have to change if women are to achieve greater equality? Great questions.
Great questions. And thank you to all of you. So on regional variances, I would not say my analysis has been very sophisticated or detailed on this issue. I would therefore only observe in a rather general way that absolutely Tokyo and Osaka are more advanced. In other words, there is an urban versus rural question. There is a big city versus smaller city imbalance, and it's absolutely the case that almost what you'd expect, more sort of deeply advanced urban areas are more advanced, but all within a relatively narrow range, and that rural areas are somewhat more conservative on these issues. But I think it would be a great area of research, actually, and I don't feel that I should rabbit on about it anymore because I haven't done research at that level of detail, and I think it would be fantastic to read such research. In terms of Abenomics and increasing women's employment, essentially the answer is spectacular success in terms of quantity, not much success in terms of quality. So absolutely that graph on the increased participation showed a great success. And that was for all sorts of reasons, including somewhat encouraged by the childcare provision, which was one of his main tools. But quality hasn't been substantially improved, and indeed, the government shied away from removing the marriage tax or the spousal tax deduction disincentive to female work and to female advancement, which I think showed that their heart wasn't entirely in it, or rather that some parts of the government disagreed with it. What's going on now is almost nothing. In other words, I think thanks to the pandemic, thanks to the weakness of Prime Minister Suga, essentially womenomics is no longer part of the current central agenda for politics for the government. That doesn't mean that it's gone forever, but I think that essentially it's been shelved for the time being. Personally, I would be quite surprised if Prime Minister Suga is still Prime Minister after September, October this year, and therefore our question will be about how durable and how stable is the next leadership and the next political coalition that's there, and therefore how serious an issue do they think this is, because the current administration is too weak to be able to really do anything serious about it. In terms of language, I'm not very qualified about that, but I would observe that I think it's going to be the other way around. I think that as women achieve greater equality in Japan, so language will change, but not until then. In other words, it's an effect, not a cause, would be my estimation about it. I don't think that Governor Koike speaks with a great level of humility, and quite rightly so. So I think that it's a consequence, and it will be an eventual consequence, and not a driver.
Those were very wise words, very, very interesting. On behalf of everyone, I really wish to thank you for a fascinating point. Talking about women in Japan, I would not. So I'm going to call on Sun to come back with reactions and further thoughts.
Okay, thank you for summoning me again, Yves. And thanks for your responses, Bill, which I absolutely agree. And just, specifically to your response on the evolving social movement led by women to speak out their rights, and the example of the resignation of Mori, you just remind me of the one article from BBC which criticized Mori's resignation was a whack-a-mole game. So to quote the article, it says, people criticize him because he came out to be whacked, but there are many other moles in the society. So like you said, the female lawyer who protested against Mori can be seen as a meaningful turning point to show more and more female start speaking out to all the injustice they have unconditionally tolerated. But this male-dominant society has a long way to go in order to root out all the moles, right? So I guess we should acknowledge this injustice and be ready to act whenever necessary. I believe this is the only visible thing we could do. And again, thank you for this wonderful talk, and thank you.
So thank you very much, Bill. Thank you, Sun. Thank you, Saya-san, and thank you, Joseph, for a wonderful event. And,
well, thank you, Yves, for organizing it, and thank you to myself too, also to Saya, to Joseph, and to Sun for wonderful introductions and questions. And I wish we could go to an izakaya.
Yes, indeed.